Thanks again for joining Macenta's webinar discussing the General Data Protection Rule and the Second Payment Services Directive. We'll be focusing on user authentication and strong authentication requirements in this webinar, with providing an overview of the laws as well. I'd like to first introduce our panelists for this webinar. First, we have Riley Leva. She's in our Sales and Market Research department. She's done a lot of research over the last few months over the Payment Services Directive that's going to be going in place next year. Also, we have Uku Tomikas. He is our lead sales researcher, has been studying the General Data Protection Rule over the last few months as well. And I'm Yuri Mikachenko, the head of marketing here at Macenta. So, as I said, we'll have an overview of the two EU laws, and we'll go deeper into the implications the laws have around user authentication and data protection, as well as user behavior online. So, one thing to keep in mind as Riley and Uku are discussing the new laws is how user behavior influences the data protection rules and data protection overall, as well as online security. So keep in mind of the things that you implement, the tools you buy for your online services, and how user behavior affects data protection. So a couple caveats I want to let you guys know that we're not giving legal advice in this webinar. We're sharing what we know regarding the two laws that are going in place next year. And we'll be opening things up for questions as well. We'll be able to answer the questions to the best of our ability. Also, if you look in the GoToWebinar control panel on your screen, there is a place to ask questions. It's about the second or third section in the panel. So if you have questions during the webinar, go ahead and type them in there. The three of us will try to answer them to the best of our abilities, and we'll also be going over some of the more pertinent questions at the very end. So without further ado, Uku, if you are ready, let's jump into the General Data Protection Rule.
Thanks, Yuri, and thanks everyone who's listening. To start off, I will give a brief overview of the main topics of the General Data Protection Regulation, but I'm mainly covering the aspects that pertain to the importance of customer authentication under GDPR. To summarize in a nutshell, just straight off, the regulation states that in regards to data processing, security measures have to be in place that are in accordance with the risks associated. So if we're thinking about, for example, account hijacking or data theft, one of the measures to combat it is having a strong multi-layered customer authentication system in place. To start, the General Data Protection Regulation is a new piece of legislation coming into effect in 2018, and it replaces a 1995 regulation. Both of the pieces of legislation we're talking about today aim to update and bring into accordance with the current era the data handling and privacy questions that surround the European Union and foreign companies handling EU citizen data. The keyword here is EU citizens, because it doesn't matter if the company itself is a European company or for example, a US company or wherever in the world. If they're handling EU citizen data, these specific regulations apply to them. And the General Data Protection Regulation is a part of the collection of human rights laws of the EU as well. And as said, it applies to all European citizens. The definition of what personal data actually means that is covered under GDPR is left purposefully broad. So the idea is that any piece of data that a subject gives to a company that can directly or indirectly use to identify the data subject. So we're talking about email addresses, browsing history, searches, IP addresses, phone numbers, cookies, you name it. Anything that can be used to directly or indirectly identify the data subject is considered as personal data. Now, there's also a specific category that comes into that. It's called special personal data, and this usually pertains to information that is very specific to a concrete person that can be used to damage that person significantly. So we're mostly talking about biometric data, for example, that if it gets leaked or gets breached, can be used to not only hack accounts and hijack accounts, but can in addition used to steal identities, which is one of the main ideas that they're doing here. And the purpose why this has been kept so broad is that the previous document was in place for 23 years. So the new document that is coming into place is designed to be in place for another 20 years, even considering the rapid expansion of all technologies, all new ideas that are coming into play, and all new features that are becoming available for more and more people and more hackers subsequently as well, that can be used to attack people and their accounts. And this ultimately brings us into the first idea, the main broad idea that I'm going to talk about, which is privacy by design. Now, privacy by design is one of the core principles, and what it essentially states is that when you're actually designing systems, you need to build the security features into the process from the get-go. So you have to have a system in place from the very beginning to make sure that all of your data gathering, handling, processing, and then storage systems are already secure and that they're already taken care of. And it also means that you need to have a strong understanding of how the entire process of data moving or data handling is taken care of. So where do you store, how do you move it, and what are the risks associated? You need to understand if I'm taking some sort of data from people and then bouncing it through my servers and then ending it up in some other server, God knows where, then I need to understand what are the risks associated with it, where do I need to use different measures to make sure that the data doesn't leak and that there are no breaches, or if there are breaches, that the breaches don't lead to significant damage to people. And to do that, you need to have something as a security information and event management system in place. Now, a CM system is not a piece of software. It's more a set of principles or guidelines that you can easily find on the web to understand a little bit more broadly, because I won't go into the details here. But essentially, it means that you have a way of monitoring the entire system, monitoring data movement, and monitoring every possible breach, and then taking the necessary steps to make sure that any breaches are notified about first to the authorities, and then if the breach is significant enough, also putting that info in the hands of data subjects as well. It's something that especially the breach notifications have been very widely publicized and are a very big part of the topic itself. And now, for moving on from privacy by design, we get to consumer rights. Now, we used to work in an opt-in situation, rather an opt-out situation, where, for example, if somebody was registering their account for a website or for a service, you could leave a pre-ticked box stating that the person would like to receive newsletters or marketing email, for example. Now, under GDPR, there is a new definition for what consent is. It needs to be freely given, specific, informed, and explicit. So it can no longer be deduced from inactivity or silence, meaning that pre-ticked boxes are an out. It's actually been one of the things that has been specifically brought out, pre-ticked boxes, I mean, in accompanying documents to the GDPR, just to state how important that fact is. And you need to be able, as a company, to verify that the person has given you consent. Now, this doesn't mean that if you don't have consent that you have no right to handle data at all. There are still certain types of rights for companies that allow data processing, such as, for example, legal requirements when we're talking about, for example, telecom companies who have to keep customer data on their servers and keep it available for 5-6 years, for example, when it pertains to anti-terrorism laws or certain tax laws and so on and so forth, as well as contractual obligations. So if you have a contract between you and your client, and in order to fulfill your contractual obligations, you need to handle the data of a data subject in a certain manner, then you're still allowed to do that even if the consent is withdrawn. You have the right to perform those actions in order to fulfill your contractual obligations until the contract itself is nullified or taken aback, or you end it, or whatever else happens to it, to essentially cancel the contract in a sense. And until you have that right, you can ask for consent if you want to handle the data subject's data in another way that isn't pursuant to the actual contract itself. So if you want to send, for example, newsletters that aren't important for the filling the services or fulfilling the tasks that you have under the contract that you have with your client, then you can ask for consent to send them newsletters, and then once they decide to perhaps revoke it, then you can't send them the newsletters anymore, but you can still fill your contractual obligations, which is one of the things that plays into that. As before, as the Data Protection Directive that preceded the GDPR stated as well, subjects have the access to access the data that has been compiled upon them, which is via a subject data access request. These requests also need to be verified in a clear manner, as well as they have the right to be forgotten. So essentially, not only do they have the right to have their data presented to them in a usable format, they also have the right to ask for the deletion of said data from that company's databases if they see so fit, unless there are, of course, again, as mentioned before, legal requirements that prohibit the company to do so. And one other new sort of right that has been really provided for the people is the right of data portability. What this essentially means is you not only have the right to retrieve the data that has been sort of compiled about you, but you also have the right to demand it provided to another service provider, for example, your data that you have provided, or, for example, have it given to you in a usable format and then give it forward to another provider. So, for example, let's take, if you're on a social media platform like Facebook, you have the right to ask Facebook for the several thousand pages of data they have on you, your friends lists, your preferences, the pages you've liked, the pages you haven't liked, so on and so forth, the options that you have put in, the apps, so on and so forth. And you have the right to take that data and take it to another social media provider, essentially giving you the ability to build a profile that would have taken you a long time, and a network that would have taken you a long time before to build from scratch. You can now build it up from the previous network that you had before. Now, the idea behind this is that they're trying to, in a sense, get rid of a lot of customer lock-in. So customers no longer can be stuck on a platform or with a company just simply because of the reasons that their important information is on there, or their friends are on there, or their network is on there. So they're trying to get rid of these lock-ins and really change that up a little bit. And this idea itself of changing customer rights and privacy by design brings us into another important part, which is the shift of liability. Now, when previously people had a weak password, for example, and their account got hacked and their data was stolen in a sense, in very many cases it wasn't really anything that the companies sort of needed to do about. So they weren't really liable for the damages that occurred if the processes they had in place were sort of strong enough. So unless they were, of course, malicious, for example, leaving malicious backdoors to open ways for hackers and so on and so forth. But with the rise of things like social engineering nowadays, in which, for example, hackers don't anymore use systems where they try to find backdoors or hack accounts or do anything like that. They actually simply pick up a phone and call any number of companies. So, for example, they call a utilities company and they want to find out a certain piece of information about a person, be it an email address or a phone number or maybe a slight credit card detail. Whatever it might be, they will try to get a tiny fragment of information about a person. So, and in order to do this, they might sometimes, for example, change their voice with programs to a female voice. They will play in the background a voice of a baby crying, just to pull at the heartstrings of the person at the other end of the phone, so they can get tiny pieces of information in order to retrieve just a sliver. And once they do that, once they have this tiny piece of information, they use that information to get another piece of information from another place, and so on and so forth, until they have a fairly strong enough picture of the person we're talking about. And then they'll use this information to, for example, gain access to your bank account, your company's bank accounts, empty it, encrypt your personal files, encrypt your company's files, and then pretty much ransom them off to you in some other way. or so on and so forth. And that essentially has driven the legislators themselves to build to demand systems in which several different ways of protecting data are put into play. That means that also the liability has shifted to the companies. If you don't have the right processes in place, you're liable for not only the damages, but also an amount of fines. So the most severe fine right now by GDPR that you can sustain because of the breaches, and if they're found to be strong enough or big enough, or if you have been warned several times, for example, is a fine of 20 million euros or 4% of your yearly revenue, which for anyone is a big chunk of change. Now, not only is it mandatory to verify consent clearly, but you also have to verify data access requests very concretely, and you have to have a good general overview of what you're doing. And you also have to have the ability to restore the availability and access to personal data in a timely manner in the event of physical or technical incident. And if we're talking about having a second layer of authentication in place, it can be a very, very useful tool to maybe not always prevent people from sustaining damages, but they will have a way of quickly getting their personal data back, for example. And another part of it is actually having compliant partners. So if we're using third-party providers who are processing our data, for example, or we're using third-party providers to provide a service for us in which they are actually sort of producing some sort of a service for us, handling our customer data, this will ultimately lead very sort of strongly into the part where we need to be aware that they are also compliant. So our partners need to be compliant, because we're also liable if they handle our data. So to summarize, under the General Data Protection Regulation, having a sort of a multi-layered authentication system in place is a measure by which you can comply with privacy by design, in that you will build it in from the very beginning and have it in place to prevent account hijacking and data theft. And it also provides you a way of having a clear and provable method of consent verification, data access request verification, and subject data deletion request verification. And as a partner for us, for example, our compliance and use of systems that enable us to provide a compliant system to our customers is paramount as well. So having these things in place can help you greatly move towards being compliant and taking the necessary steps that can help you reach that point in time. And that's it from my side. Thanks, guys.
Awesome. Thanks, Uku. Now I'd like to pass it off to Riley to go over the Payment Services Directive and the details around that, as well as authentication requirements under this rule as well. So Riley, if you're ready, go ahead and take over.
Yep. Thanks, Yuri. And it's really great to see that we have so many listeners with us today. So thanks for joining us. So for the starters, as we all know, the payment industry is currently undergoing significant transformation, especially with the advent of fintech, which is now posing a serious threat to the revenues and the customer bases of traditional financial institutions. And to compound matters for banks in particular is the revised Payment Service Directive. It's actually a data and technology-based directive that aims to promote competition and innovation within the European payments market, as well as to improve the security for online payments and account access. It comes fully into effect in January 2018, when each of the European Union member countries will transpose this directive's financial guidelines into their national laws. And many believe that it could actually play a vital role in changing banking as we know it now. And the primary goal of this new directive is to create a single integrated market for payment services, and doing it by standardizing the regulations for banks and for the new payment service providers, as well as we have started to see. And by that I mean internet banking, mobile banking apps, e-wallets, and so on and so on and so on. As these innovative service providers were not regulated by the PSD2, it was time to make some changes. And what was lacking in the first directive is actually now covered by the second. For example, under the first directive, the transparency and conduct of business requirements applied only to those transactions where both the payer and the recipient sides were located in the EU, and where the payments was made in euros or another member state currencies. And PSD2 actually extends this directive's geographical scope to include transactions where only one side is located in the EU, and as well it will also include transactions in non-EU currencies. So it will ensure transparency and fair competition, and it will actually break down the barriers for the new payment services too. And this is something that will definitely benefit the customers. These two new service providers that will be entering the market are, firstly, account information service providers, and they will be enabled to have access to banking's customer account information, and they will be permitted to analyze customer spending habits, as well as coordinate customers' account information from various banks into just one single viewpoint. And the second ones are payment initiation service providers. Meanwhile, they will be enabled to initiate payments on behalf of customers, and it includes bill payments and peer-to-peer transfers as well. And there has also been researches on this subject, and according to estimates from Messenger, these services could make up around 60% of online retail payments by 2020. So, in other words, PSD2 obligates banks to give these third-party providers access to their customer accounts through open APIs. And that way they will be allowing third parties to build financial services on top of banks' data and infrastructure. And this will definitely open the doors to some very major tech companies who have had their eyes on the payments industry for a long time now. The most obvious one is definitely Apple, and they have made the first step like few years ago already with Apple Pay. But we also got Google, Facebook, and even Airbnbs, and they all want to get a little bite from the payments market. And this will definitely change the payments value chain, because when banks' customers can use third-party providers such as social media platforms or messaging apps to pay bills straight from their bank accounts, then banks might lose many of the customer interactions. And this will happen, of course, if the banks don't create equally attractive solutions for their clients. So yeah, the biggest winners of this new law are definitely users, because PSD2 also introduces several measures which will protect customer rights and improve customer services around payments. First of all, it will ban surcharging, for example. Companies such as airlines or event organizers will not be allowed to charge an additional card fee on top of the transaction value. It will also offer better protection around pre-authorization for card payments, where the final amount is not known in advance, such as hotel bookings, car rentals, and so on and so on. In that case, the merchant will only be able to lock funds to a limit approved by the cardholder. And that's not all. It will also provide a legacy basis to unconditional refund right for direct debit payments, and consumers will be better protected against fraud and payment incidents, as the amount they would be obligated to pay for unauthorized payment will be brought down from 150 to 50 euros. And that will still have the exception of fraud committed by the payer, of course. So yeah, there's no doubt that PSD2 will offer great opportunities to clients and as well as to businesses. But these new payment and information access tools can be vulnerable to threats such as fraud, data breaches, cyber attacks, and so on and so on. And these regulations therefore seek to establish a security baseline to help mitigate those threats and secure customer assets. And the main security highlights of this new law are considerations around the regulatory technical standard document. And this includes strong customer authentication. You see, when customers access their payment accounts online, initiate electronic payment transactions, or carry out any other action through remote channels that may imply risk of payment fraud or other abuses, then so-called strong customer authentication will be required. And the minimum requirements are the use of two-factor authentication. And this is actually a norm that is already widely adopted by the banking industry. Simply said, strong customer authentication is a process that validates the identity of the customer by the use of two or even more distinct and independent elements. And these are being categorized as knowledge, something known only to the customers, such as password or PIN. The second one is possession, something held by the customer, such as payment card or mobile phone, and inheritance, something because only the customer is, such as fingerprint or voice recognition or something similar to that. And one of these elements must generate one-time authentication code. And so far we have seen that the most common forms of strong customer authentication have been mobile app, SMS, hardware tokens, or biometrics. And of course, all of before named authentication options have their pluses and minuses. But when taking a decision, we need to keep in mind the regulatory technical standard document, and this sets out requirements of how and when to apply two-factor or multi-factor authentication in the context of PSD2. This document has now been submitted to the Commission, and it will be applicable 18 months after it's entered into force. And even though the requirements of 2FA is a new thing to some companies and users as well, it's actually possible to accomplish it while still maintaining a great user experience that even might help to improve sales or conversion rates. Because thankfully, the final language of the regulation reflects a modern understanding of multi-factor authentication. And while the final draft of RTS requires two secure and distinct factors, it also recognizes that these factors can be housed in a single multi-purpose device. And by that I mean mobile phone, tablet, PC, and so on and so on. As long as these separate secure execution environments are used, and of course trusted platform models are as well. And actually, the main mobile operating systems, Android and iOS, most likely meet the requirements of separate trusted execution environments via their sandboxing techniques. So the organizations can leverage these devices and capabilities to meet strong customer authentication requirements easily. And this is actually convenient for the users as well, because these devices are already being used daily. But there are other requirements as well that we need to keep in mind. And this means that no matter what way you are delivering PIN codes to your customers, it clearly needs to show the payment and the payee information to the users in every step of transaction. And this means that it needs to be showed when the PIN is generated, when it's delivered, and in the interface when the PIN is submitted, and so on and so on. Also, the mobile apps need to exchange payment information via secure channel, and should be equipped with additional security software that can detect malicious software itself and prevent it from interfering with the payment transaction. And it makes sense, but these requirements are kind of broad, so we cannot say exactly what technique should be used. And the third one is the requirement to protect the confidentiality of the payment information. And this could be actually seen as the need to encrypt the payment information in the SMS message. But we cannot be 100% sure right now, and it will be cleared out after the RTS is being confirmed. And And based on this new directive that we have in our hands right now, the payer's payment service provider is liable for unauthorized payments, even if he provides a strong customer authentication in line with their RTS. And this should make payment service providers not simply choose the strong customer authentication procedure that meets the requirements of RTS, but to select procedure that is based on the payment risk that they have in their organization. And if you are talking about the timelines and dates, then the text of RTS is ready. It is currently being translated and it is expected to be published around 25th of November. And in order to become official, the RTS needs to be published in the official journal of European Union, and this should happen in late February 2018. And it will go into effect 18 months later, so we expect it to happen August 2019. Yeah, so I guess it's a lot of information to take in, but as the dates are getting closer, then right now is the right time for business owners to start looking around and thinking what should be the right solution for their organization. And it would be the smart move in the light of risk, user experience, cost, and so on. And on that note, I will give it back to Yuri, and if you have any questions, then let me know.
Awesome, thanks, Riley. So an interesting piece of this law and the things that we've been covering today sheds light on what's already been happening in the industry, right? So 4 out of every 5 hacking-related breaches have been caused by weak or stolen credentials, right? Now, this law addresses that issue with the requirement for at least two-factor authentication, but it's been happening for years. If you go to the website haveibeenpwned.com, you'll see that nearly 5 billion usernames and passwords have been leaked online, and the hackers have access to that information. But now the liability of a hack due to a weak username and password does not fall on the users. It falls on the organizations providing the online service or the mobile app, right? That's one of the biggest changes coming with these laws. So regarding GDPR, what does Macenta do? What can we do regarding strong customer authentication? Well, we've invested a lot of time and money into building out our 2FA toolkit that has some of the most secure ways of delivering PIN codes for people to log in to online services or mobile applications. So to start, we have our 2FA API that sends both time-based one-time passwords and SMS PIN codes. So if a user is using our 2FA mobile app called Verigator, we'll be using time-based one-time passwords, which is the most secure way of using two-factor authentication with a mobile application. But if users don't have the application, they fall back to SMS, and we can send an SMS PIN code as well. Now, PSD2 is a little bit more complex as we need to send payment information when a transaction is made, right? So users can log in to their account services using our Verigator application, which is again our time-based one-time password app for users. They can use that to log in, but payment information for a transaction and the PIN code would have to come through SMS, right? Because right now there is no secure way of us sending that information through our Verigator app. But we do have ways to do it through Macenta Solution to cover both GDPR and PSD2 strong customer authentication requirements. So Uku, thanks again for presenting the information. We do have some questions that have come through. The first one, I think I'm going to pass this one off to Uku. It's regarding GDPR. It's what about consent versus legitimate interest? How much can really be considered legitimate interest? Uku?
Yeah, thanks for that. The first question is definitely a doozy and one of the hardest ones to actually answer. It's one of the biggest flaws of GDPR is bringing in the legitimate interest sort of way of data processing, but at the same time not giving a lot of ideas of what it actually constitutes. So from what I've been able to learn so far, if we, for example, look at recital 47, fraud prevention constitutes a legitimate interest. If we look at recital 47, it states that the necessary and proportionate processing for network security constitutes a legitimate interest. And if we look at recital 50, it names that sharing evidence of possible criminal acts to the authorities should be regarded as being in the legitimate interest of peoples. And at the same time, recital 47 also says that the processing of personal data for direct marketing purposes may be regarded as carried out for a legitimate interest. Now, the part of may be considered, of course, is again sort of a big problem in there. And one of the things that has been mentioned was that behavioral advertising and data brokering, for example, must be based on consent, because that does not constitute legitimate interest, as it doesn't have what could be stated as a direct interest to the company that is actually obtaining the data. So when we're talking about legitimate interest in the sense of direct marketing, the value needs to be shown to directly go to the company that is doing the data processing. In that case, it can be considered as legitimate interest. But ultimately, this is more of a hearsay in a sense, because the topic itself hasn't been debated as much yet. There are very many different opinions on it. And ultimately, as with very many other aspects of law and of these legislations, I think that the sort of the ironing out of the kinks of this topic will ultimately come through different legal battles and years of actually implementing this, going through different auditing systems, going through the countries themselves, who ultimately end up really giving the regulation, the definitions that we, and the answers that we're looking for now. But at this point, that's probably the best answer I can give it.
Cool, awesome, thanks, Ugo. I hope that answers the question. Again, if you guys have more questions or thoughts, just go ahead and please share them in the questions section. If you want to go over audio as well, you can raise your hand in the panel as well, and I can go ahead and let you speak as well. But we do have another question that came in, and there's more coming in. This one's regarding our 2FA product set. I'll let, I don't know, I think Uku, you'll probably have the answer for this one. Does using Macenta's 2FA product make us compliant with GDPR and PSD2, and if yes, how?
So if we're taking into consideration the entire scope of the both documents to know, you need to understand that there are very many different aspects to it, as I discussed before. What Macenta helps tackle is the part of customer authentication, transactional authentication, this transaction verification when we're talking about the Second Payment Service Directive, as well as the ability to verify consent, verify data access requests, deletion requests, so on and so forth. And for those things, you can use both the 2FA toolkit, to Verigate your app, and combine those things to have a broad way of both protecting data as well as protecting customer accounts, and giving the ability to retrieve the accounts for the customers quickly, that they can again access their accounts. When we're talking about documentation that regards to, for example, consent, when we're talking about implementing a CM system or the security information and event management system, then for those, we ourselves are compliant as a partner, but we do not give compliance in those aspects to people to whom we provide our service to.
Great. Okay, and that looks like we have more questions coming in. All right, Riley or Uku, you guys can take this one. Will the new directives also be used for data and platforms that don't include payments but include personal data and document signing? And then the follow-up question is, what are the most important changes to that? Let me know if you want me to repeat it, Uku or Riley.
I can take this one. I hope. When we're talking about PSD2, I don't think that for when we're signing documents, unless they're, for example, transactional documents, I don't think PSD2 applies. I may be wrong. This is my opinion from what I've been learning about the two pieces of legislation so far. But GDPR should apply for those aspects as well. So you need to have a system in place where you have all necessary procedures for verification set in place. How it will directly affect and what will be the biggest issues is the fact that when we're talking about, for example, signing documents and signing documents to different people, the person sending the document and receiving the document need to be verified, for example. The process that the data is sent through needs to be monitored, and any breaches need to be dealt with quickly and effectively, as well as have systems in place for both the original signing of the documents, where the signing process itself is protected in a manner where it can't be breached, or the keys that are used cannot be, for example, duplicated or breached in any way, as well as the storage of said documents needs to be done in a safe manner before they are opened via a key, for example, that is in use. I hope that answers the question. If not, let me know if there are some specifics I left out that you're interested in.
Yeah, I think that answers the question. But just to generalize it, it's if there's no payment information or any kind of financial transaction happening, then it doesn't sound like PSD2 really applies. But GDPR, which is more broad, still does, and there are authentication requirements under GDPR, right? That makes sense. Oh, cool.
Yeah, that makes sense. It isn't explicitly defined that you have to have a multi-layered authentication system in place. It says that you need to have a system in place that is pursuant to the risks associated. But currently, from the research we've done, it's really quite impossible to see any other more effective measure than having a multi-layered system in place. Even if, for example, you're using encryption, then in even those cases, having a second layer on top of encryption will still help you combat things like retrieving access to an account if, for example, customer keys, encryption keys are breached, for example.
So I got a follow-up question from Risto. He's got a follow-up question to make sure we're answering this one correctly. And actually, Ludmila is got some information too. So Ludmila, if you're available to chat with us too, I can unmute your mic, and you can give us some information that you know as well and share if you're interested. Okay, but maybe later. But we have a follow-up question from Risto regarding this one, Uku. There is a payment, but will be done manually by the user when activity takes place. Does this mean that multi-layered identification or authentication must be implemented? So there is a payment, which will be done manually by the user, and when that transaction or activity takes place, is multi-factor authentication required?
Okay, that's an interesting question. For me, the question in this part would be that is the payment itself, when it's made, for example, if it's made through a bank or sort of a gateway, if it's made by that manner, and it isn't directly, it's connected to the signing of the documents, but it's more of a separate procedure from that. Then that particular procedure of making that payment, that would need a multi-layer authentication in place. But if we're talking about the signing of the document itself, I'm not certain. It definitely doesn't hurt to have it in place, and under GDPR, it's strongly recommended that you have it in place. But to tell you concretely that it's a 100% necessity, then I'd be lying, because I am not 100% sure about that. But we're talking about the payment itself, especially if we're using a gateway or a third processing provider, they definitely have to have the system in place.
Yeah, exactly. So if the transaction is being made electronically, then yes, multi-factor authentication will be required. And when the user is logging in to use the signing service in the first place, there should be a multi-factor authentication in place as well, just to make sure that the user signing the document is the user, the right user, the right person. If that makes sense, right? So you want to authenticate the user before they actually sign the document. So let me know if that answers the question or not. But we do have another question, and just so we can always come back to you if you have any follow-ups. This next question is there publicly accessible simple language checklist for GDPR compliance available? So pretty much a step-by-step checklist for GDPR compliance. Raili or Oku, you guys have both been digging into this. Does this exist yet from the European Union Commission that wrote the laws, or from the European Banking Authority for PSD2? Does that, is there a checklist yet, or are they going to provide it?
If Riley doesn't mind, I can take this. The really simple, straightforward answer is no. I have not sort of stumbled upon it yet. There are several sites, or even like official sites, that provide a 10-step guide to becoming compliant, but most of it is point sort of like, let's say, point number 3, and take a look at how you're currently processing your data, evaluate the risks associated, and implement necessary measures to combat said risks, which is pretty much just reading off GDPR. So RTS, for example, does give certain parameters as it is the regulatory technical standards document, right? It says certain aspects that are usable. For example, if we're talking about 2FA, what things can be put into place and what would be pursuant under PSD2 and ultimately pursuant under GDPR as well. But a step-by-step checklist of things that you have to definitely do in order to be compliant. If you move from A to Z and have all of those covered, you'll be set. That does not exist. It's in a very broad sense where you are given the answers, because the document itself is purposefully sort of kept broad in order to sort of comply with future changes in technology as well. If we have new technologies that are going to bring in new ways of data handling, if, for example, we'll be essentially continuously communicating with each other through VR, for example, then there are new ways of data processing that need to be taken into consideration. So it's left purposefully broad. The idea of GDPR is that data processing and data processing protection needs to be an ongoing effort all the time. Needs to be built into the products from the get-go, maintained, updated, and kept in accordance with the risks, as well as evaluating the risks all the time.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Oku. Yeah. Regarding legislation coming out of any type of authority, they try to keep it somewhat vague because eventually some of these laws will be challenged in court. But the regulatory technical standards do apply, and those are pretty specific. And I'll follow up with Riley to see if we can get you more information around RTS as well, because those are pretty specific. Another question, Riley, this one's going to be for you. The questions around SMS 2FA. Is sending SMS to client's phone qualified as strong customer authentication, meaning that the code is generated in bank's IT system and the client enters it and logs in using that code? Basically the same way as Smart ID or Mobile ID here in Estonia, but the device in question is not a smartphone but a regular cell phone. Also, what if the user uses a calling card and it's not a contractual client, so it's one of these the virtual networks as well, using the cards, so meaning that his or her identity has not been authenticated. So it's a two-part question. Is SMS qualified for strong customer authentication? And second, if they're not using a contractual phone, so they're using like a mobile or a virtual network, and the identity has not been authenticated to the actual phone or to the SIM card.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually a really good question, because when we are talking about the RTS, and we are taking this document into consideration when we are thinking about the strong customer authentication, then this actually tells us that SMS verification or authentication is actually suitable for that. And this doesn't mean that if the client is not a contractual client or using an SMS or using a SIM card only, this doesn't mean that this isn't a good option still, because the RTS states that if the PIN is generated and is delivered via secure channels, then this is a good authentication option in that sense. I don't know if that answers the question, or did I understand it right?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna rephrase it a little bit, but it does answer the question. So SMS regarding the regulatory technical standards, it does qualify for strong customer authentication. Regarding the non-contractual phone, say they're using a virtual network, or they're just paying upfront monthly for a SIM card. When the user signs up for your account, say that you are a bank or a financial services company of any sort, and the user signs up for an account with your company, then they provide a phone number tied to that account. Now, when the user signs up and they provide that phone number, you can immediately verify that this is the phone number that they're going to be using, right? So that you send them an SMS to verify that they're holding this phone, whether it's a smartphone or not. And then this phone number is tied to their account moving forward. So this person would have to maintain possession of this phone to authenticate when they log in or provide or do a transaction online, regardless. So even if it is a non-contractual phone, it will still work. Hope that answers the question. So it has to do with the sign-up process within the mobile service, or to the online financial service. So, and we are running out of time here. I don't want to keep you guys too long, but it sounds like we answered the question, so it's good. But I think that's it. I'm going to send a follow-up email within the next 24 hours to everybody with some more information, as well as a way you can contact us. But if you have questions, go ahead and email us, whether it's sales@macenta.com or you can email Riley or Uku or myself. We can pass you the right people to answer questions. Visit macenta.com to check out our APIs, and try our Variegator app, our 2FA application. It's variegator.com to find the links to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, and take a try and just try out our 2FA process and our application, and get more information around our 2FA API as well when you check out our website. But more information is to come via email. So again, thanks for all the questions. Really appreciate it. I'm glad we could answer them at the best of our abilities. Thanks for joining our webinar. Watch for more information when the webinar is coming up, as well as we want to share as much as we know with our customers overall. So thanks again, guys. We will talk to you guys next time.